The wind that swept down from the Cumberland Plateau in the second week of December 1864 didn't feel like the final breaths of a dying year. It felt like the breath of a dying age. In the trenches outside Nashville, Tennessee, the ground wasn't merely cold, it was iron hard, frozen by a sudden, vicious plunge in temperature that turned the red clay of Middle Tennessee into a landscape of jagged ruts and slick, treacherous ice. But the cold was secondary to the memory of fire. For the men of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, huddled in their thin blankets, lacking shoes, lacking coats, and lacking hope, the chill of the air was nothing compared to the ghosts that walked among them. They had just come from Franklin. Only 2 weeks earlier, on November 30th, General John Bell Hood had hurled this army against the Union breastworks at Franklin, Tennessee, 18 miles to the south. In just 5 hours of fighting so intense, so visceral, and so suicidal that it had been called the Gettysburg of the West, Hood had lost 7,000 men. 6 Confederate generals were dead. The soul of the army had been ripped out, bayoneted, and left to bleed on the banks of the Harpeth River. And yet they marched on. They marched north, toward Nashville, the great prize, the fortified city that had been in Union hands since early 1862. Why? Why march a broken army against a fortress city held by a force nearly twice your size? Because John Bell Hood knew no other way. He was a man who associated valor with casualties, a commander who had lost the use of an arm at Gettysburg and a leg at Chickamauga, and who now had to be strapped into his saddle. He believed that the offensive was the only honorable form of warfare. And so he brought his bleeding, shivering army to the hills south of Nashville, entrenching them in a thin, desperate line, and dared the Union to come out and fight. Inside the city, the Union Army of the Cumberland was waiting. But they weren't just waiting for Hood. They were waiting on the weather, and they were waiting on the word of one man, Major General George H. Thomas. George Thomas was a Virginian who had remained loyal to the Union, a decision that cost him his family and his home state. He was a deliberate man, known to his troops as Pap and to history as the Rock of Chickamauga. George Thomas wasn't a man who rushed things. He didn't panic. And in the first weeks of December 1864, he would not be bullied, not even by Ulysses S. Grant. So today, on Stories of the Civil War, we're not just moving counters on a map. We're going down into the frozen trenches. We're going to read the letters written by shaking hands by the light of tallow candles. We're going to stand on the icy slopes of Shies Hill and walk the bloody cornfields near the peach orchard. We're going to witness the death of one army and the vindication of another. This is the story of the Battle of Nashville. The narrative of Nashville usually begins with the first gunshots, but the true battle began days earlier in the silence of the freeze. On December 9th, 1864, a sleet storm of biblical proportions had descended on the city. The temperature plummeted. Rain had turned to sleet, and sleet into snow, coating the hills and the roads in a sheet of ice so thick that the men and horses couldn't stand on it. And so imagine the scene. Nashville, already a teeming hub of refugees, soldiers, and government officials, ground to a halt. The hills surrounding the city, hills that would soon be famous with names like Overton and Compton, were white and silent. In the Union camps, the soldiers huddled in their dog tents, trying to keep warm. We have a vivid window into this frozen world through the diary of Chaplain Elijah Evan Edwards of the 7th Minnesota Infantry. Edwards wasn't your typical soldier. He was a man of letters, a professor of ancient languages, and an artist who sketched the scenes around him. He brought a poet's eye to the misery of the camp. And on the days leading up to the battle, he looked out at the city and saw a surreal landscape. He described the refugees pouring into the city, terrified, reporting that Hood and his 40,000 men were at the gates. Edwards writes of passing a batch of Confederate prisoners in the street during this lull. He saw them as, quote, a weary, worn, jaded-looking set, end quote. He was particularly struck by one officer, a colonel with red hair and long and glorious curls, whose eyes were red and inflamed, his face sallow and pinched, and from whom an odor of whiskey pervaded. Edwards sketched this miserable man as he described him, capturing the face of the enemy, exhausted, intoxicated, and proud. Now, the whiskey that the Confederate colonel reeked of wasn't just a luxury or an escape. It was a necessity for survival in the sub-zero temperatures. But it wasn't just the Confederates who sought solace in the bottle. The cold was a physical assault, a tangible enemy that gnawed at the extremities. A soldier named Beale on the Union side, campaigning in similar weather, noted that the Army had been receiving 2 rations of whiskey a day to combat the, quote, severe weather and poor water. Whiskey was considered medicinal. It was a way to fortify the body and the mind against the chill that seeped into the bones. Soldiers believed that liquor fortified their bodies and minds and kept them able to serve in and survive the war. When the rations were stopped, the men missed it dearly. In the Union camps around Nashville, officers kept private stores and enlisted men procured what they could from camp sutlers, fighting the cold with every drop they could find. And while the soldiers shivered and drank, a different kind of storm was brewing in the telegraph wires between Nashville and City Point, Virginia. General Ulysses S. Grant, the general-in-chief of Union armies, was losing his patience. Grant was a man of action. He looked at the map and saw Hood's army sitting exposed outside Nashville. He wanted Thomas to attack immediately. Grant sent telegram after telegram, urging, cajoling, and finally threatening Thomas. Attack at once, Grant wired. But Thomas looked out his window at the sheet of ice covering the world. He knew his cavalry couldn't maneuver. He knew his infantry would be sliding down the hills into the sights of Confederate rifles. Major General George H. Thomas and Brigadier General James H. Wilson, the 27-year-old cavalry prodigy, sat huddled over supper at Nashville's St. Cloud Hotel on the night of December 12th. The frustration was palpable. Wilson, Thomas lamented, the Washington authorities treat me like I'm a boy. They seem to think me incapable of fighting a battle. Thomas's assessment of the situation was grounded in the physical reality of the ice. He wired General Halleck on December 11th, explaining that a terrible storm of freezing rain had made movement impossible. Captain J.C. Van Duzer of the Telegraph Corps corroborated this, wiring that, quote, the thaw has begun, and tomorrow we can move without skates, end quote. That was the reality, without skates. If they moved now, they would be fighting on an ice rink. But Grant, sitting hundreds of miles away in Virginia, didn't want to hear about ice. He was so furious at Thomas's delay that he actually issued an order on December 9th to relieve Thomas of command and replace him with Major General John Schofield. Schofield was Thomas's subordinate, a man ambitious and eager for promotion. He was right there in Nashville, ready to take over. But the order was suspended at the last minute. Grant decided to give Thomas one more chance. He even started traveling west himself to take personal command. He got as far as Washington when the news finally broke. The ice began to melt on December 13th. The ground turned from a skating rink into a quagmire of freezing mud. But Thomas was ready. He had used the time to organize his forces, particularly his cavalry under Wilson. Thomas had a plan. He wouldn't just defeat Hood. He would annihilate him. The plan itself was a masterclass in deception. He would launch a feint, a fake attack on the Confederate right flank, the eastern side of the line. This would draw Hood's attention and his reserves. Then, once Hood was committed, Thomas would unleash a massive sledgehammer blow on the Confederate left, swinging his entire army like a giant gate to crush the rebels against the hills. It was a sound plan, a perfect plan. But as every soldier knows, plans rarely survive first contact with the enemy or the mud. Across the lines, the situation was far more grim. The Confederate Army of Tennessee wasn't just cold, it was starving. They had arrived at Nashville with the shattered remnants of a force that had marched out of Georgia. We have a haunting glimpse into their world through the diary of Robert Battle, a Confederate surgeon turned scout and spy. Battle was a local boy from College Grove. He knew this terrain intimately. His diary, written in pencil in a black cloth book, captures the manic oscillation between hope and despair. In late November, Battle wrote of the excitement building among citizens as they anticipated Hood's arrival. He said, quote, "All in high spirits about the rebels coming half again into our old country," end quote, on November 27th. But then came Franklin. On November 30th, Battle heard the guns. He wrote simply, quote, "The fight was terrific beyond description," end quote. By mid-December, Battle said that he and his comrades were overjoyed to be near Nashville, delighted at the idea of being in the rebel lines. They were recruiting local boys, citizens of conscript age anxious to join up. But this enthusiasm masked a rotting core. This army was barefoot. The supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. And they were facing a Union army that was well-fed, well-clothed, and vastly superior in numbers. Another perspective comes from Simon Mayer, a Jewish Confederate soldier. In his diary and letters, we see a man fighting not just for territory, but for a sense of honor and belonging. He wrote of his desire to prove that, quote, "a brother of mine acted the coward," was not true of him. He wrote that he was fighting to defend their homeland out of a hatred for the Yankees that he viewed as engaging in destruction and murder. Mayer's writings revealed the complex motivations of the men in the trench lines. There was patriotism, there was social pressure, and there was a desperate need to protect the home from what they viewed as a barbarian invasion. But even the most ardent patriotism couldn't fix a lack of shoes and food. As the ice melted into the mud, the Confederate soldier looked at his bleeding feet and wondered how much more he could take. The morning of Thursday, December 15th, 1864, dawned under a heavy blanket of fog. It was a pea soup fog, thick and gray, rising from the earth and the Cumberland River, obscuring the hills and hiding the armies from one another. For the Confederate sentries shivering in their rifle pits, the world ended 10 feet in front of their faces. They could hear them, though. The muffled tramp of thousands of boots, the jingle of cavalry bridles, the creak of artillery caissons. The Union beast was awakening. General Thomas was unleashing his diversion. To lead this attack on the Confederate right, he chose a force that many in the Army, and certainly everyone in the Confederate Army, viewed with skepticism, if not open contempt. He chose the Provisional Detachment under Major General James Steedman. Steedman's force was a motley collection. It included a brigade of white troops described by their own commander as new conscripts, convalescents, and bounty jumpers. But the core of Steedman's force was different. It consisted of 2 brigades of United States colored troops. These were the 1st and 2nd Colored Brigades, regiments like the 12th, 13th, 14th, 17th, 18th, and 100th U.S. Colored Troops. Most of these men were formerly enslaved people from Tennessee and Alabama. They had built forts around Nashville. They had guarded the railroads. They'd been used as laborers, teamsters, and cooks. But they had rarely been allowed to fight in a major pitched battle. The prejudice against these men was, at times, immense. Many Union officers believed black men lacked the courage for combat. The Confederates viewed them not as soldiers, but as rebellious property who deserved no quarter if captured. But on this foggy morning, George Thomas was giving them their chance. And among them was the 13th U.S. Colored Troops, a regiment organized right there in Middle Tennessee, composed largely of men from Murfreesboro, Gallatin, and Franklin. I want to look for a moment at the men of the 13th. These men were fighting for something abstract to the white soldiers from Minnesota or Ohio. They were fighting for the very right to exist as men. They were fighting on the soil where they had been enslaved. There was Private Derry Armstrong of Company A. There was Private Miles German, who had been enslaved by the German family in Franklin, just a few miles away. German wouldn't survive this campaign. He would die of wounds in a Nashville hospital a few weeks later. There was Sergeant Theophilus Watson, a furnaceman from the ironworks, born in Williamson County. These men stood in the fog, gripping their Enfields, waiting for the order to advance against the Confederate works at a place called Granbury's Lunette. Granbury's Lunette was a strong point on the Confederate right, close to the railroad cut. It was named after General Hiram Granbury, who had been one of the 6 Confederate generals killed at Franklin a few weeks earlier. It was manned by the remnants of Granbury's old brigade, tough, hardened Texans who had seen it all. At the signal, the U.S. Colored Troops moved forward. The fog swirled around them. As they approached the Lunette, the Confederate artillery opened up, canister shot, tin cans filled with lead balls that tore through the fog, shredding the ranks of the advancing black troops. The 1st Colored Brigade took the brunt of this fire. They became trapped in the railroad cut, a deep gash in the earth that turned into a slaughter pen. They suffered heavy casualties, nearly 100 men falling in a matter of minutes. Men dove for cover in the cut, pinned down by murderous fire from above. But the 2nd Brigade, which included the 13th U.S. Colored Troops, fared better. They didn't break. They didn't run. They surged forward, occupying the outer earthworks and engaging the Texans in a ferocious firefight that lasted for the rest of the day. They held their ground. They proved in the bloody mud of Granbury's Lunette that they were men, that they were soldiers. The diversion worked. Hood, hearing the roar of battle to his right, believed it was the main attack. He kept his reserves pinned there, watching the black troops through the smoke. What he didn't know was the true danger was massing 4 miles to the west. While Steedman's men were trading shots at the Lunette, the main Union force was executing a massive wheeling maneuver. Imagine a giant door hinged on the center of the line, swinging shut on the Confederate left flank. This force was massive. It included the 4th Corps under General Thomas Wood, the 16th Corps under General A.J. Smith, and Wilson's Cavalry Corps, 12,000 troopers armed with Spencer repeating rifles. The Confederate left was held by General A.P. Stewart. His men were spread thin, hiding behind stone walls and hastily dug dirt mounds. They were cold, hungry, and exhausted. And suddenly, out of the lifting fog, they saw a sea of blue. It wasn't just a line of battle, it was a deluge. The Union infantry, supported by the rapid fire capability of the dismounted cavalry, smashed into the Confederate redoubts. Redoubt number 4, redoubt number 5. These were small earthen forts meant to anchor the line. They were overrun in a matter of minutes. The Union troops swarmed over the walls. The Confederates, outnumbered and outgunned, broke. We have a Union soldier named Charles Grundy who left behind a letter written just days later to his friend Henry. Grundy was there in the thick of the fighting. He writes with a mix of bravado but also relief. He says, quote, "I tell you, I made the old viol ring more than once on Brush Creek." He says, referring to his fiddle playing, a strange human detail amidst the carnage. But he also alludes to the uncertainty of it all when he writes, "Don't know how long I shall remain here, but I hope not much longer." As the afternoon wore on, the Confederate line simply unraveled. It was a rout. Men threw down their muskets and ran. The grand wheel of the Union Army was crushing everything in its path. Major Joseph Cummings, a staff officer for General Hood, later recalled the chaos of the day. He described the damn fool exploits of officers trying to rally men on white horses, making themselves perfect targets in the process. Cummings himself was devoted to a barrel of Robinson County whiskey that he kept at headquarters, perhaps the only comfort available as the world collapsed around him. Hood, who realized too late that the attack on the right was just a feint, tried to shift his troops. But the roads were clogged, the distances too great, and by the time the sun began to set on December 15th, the Confederate Army had been pushed back several miles. They were battered, confused, and dangerously demoralized. But they weren't dead yet. Night fell, and that brought the freezing cold back with a vengeance. The fighting died down, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the clatter of spades. Hood was not retreating to Franklin. Not yet. He was pulling back to a tighter, shorter line in the hills about 2 miles south. He anchored his new line on 2 high points. On his right, he chose Overton Hill, also known as Peach Orchard Hill. On his left, he chose a steep, conical hill on the property of the Compton family. It was called Compton's Hill. By the next evening, it would have a different name. That night, December 15th, was a sleepless one. In the Union camps, confidence was high, but so was the tension. They knew they had hurt Hood, but they hadn't yet destroyed him. In the no man's land between the lines stood the Bradford house. Mary Bradford lived there, a woman with staunch Confederate sympathies. Her home was now directly in the path of the war. Her friend, White May, was a legend in the area, a woman known for smuggling boots, pistols, and medicine to the rebels under her petticoats. There's a story told of White May that captures the spirit of these two women. Once when she was searched by a federal officer who found the contraband beneath her skirts, she remarked coolly, quote, "Well, I've often heard of a fellow feeling, but I've never experienced it until now," end quote. Mary Bradford sat in her home that night listening to the sounds of the Army's repositioning in the dark. She resolved that she wasn't going to leave. This was her home, and the next day she would witness the death of an army from her front porch. Friday, December 16th. The day broke cold and gray, with a steady, miserable rain that would turn the frozen ground into a slurry of mud. Hood's new line was a strong one. On the right, Peach Orchard Hill commanded the Franklin Pike. On the left, Compton's Hill commanded the Granny White Pike. Between them, a stone wall ran along the road, giving excellent cover. General Thomas, methodical as ever, planned to repeat his success. He would hit both flanks, but this time the feint on the right would be a genuine, full-scale assault. The task of taking the Peach Orchard Hill fell to the 4th Corps and once again to the colored brigades. The hill itself was steep, and it was crowned with Confederate artillery and entrenched infantry. It was a death trap. To attack it, Union troops had to cross open ground, exposing themselves to plunging fire from the summit. At 3 p.m., the order came. The 2nd Colored Brigade, commanded by Colonel Charles Thompson, stepped off. This brigade included the 12th, 100th, and the 13th U.S. Colored Troops. The 13th was in the second line, supporting the others. But as the first line hit the slope, they were met with a wall of fire. Canister, grape shot, and musketry tore into them. The attack stalled. Men dove for cover behind stumps and rocks. Seeing the first line falter, the 13th did not stop. They pushed through the stalled troops. They climbed over their own dead and wounded. They surged up the hill, led by their officers and their color guard. The flag. In the Civil War, the regimental flag was everything. It was the soul of the unit, the rallying point, the proof of honor. To lose the flag was a disgrace. For a Union soldier to capture a Confederate flag was an automatic Medal of Honor. It was the highest glory. The flag of the 13th U.S. Colored Troops, well, it was special. It had been presented to them by the colored ladies of Murfreesboro. It was a symbol of their community, their women, and of their hope for the future. As the 13th charged up Peach Orchard Hill, Confederate fire concentrated on the flag. The color bearer went down. Another man grabbed it. He went down. A third man grabbed it, raising it high. He was shot. 5 times. 5 different men of the color guard were shot down carrying that flag up the slopes of Peach Orchard Hill. One of them was likely Sergeant Theophilus Watson, the furnace man from Williamson County. He took a bullet to the spine, a wound that would kill him 2 weeks later in a hospital bed on New Year's Eve. Another casualty was Corporal John Gordon, also from Franklin. He would survive the battle, but the trauma of the day would follow him until his death in 1891. The regiment finally reached the Confederate works. They were close enough to see the faces of the enemy, but they couldn't break through. The supporting white regiments on their flank had been driven back, leaving the 13th exposed to a crossfire that was simply unendurable. They had to retreat. They fell back down the hill, leaving the slopes carpeted with blue uniforms. The 13th U.S. Colored Troops suffered the highest casualties of any regiment in the battle, 221 men, nearly 40% of their strength. But they hadn't failed. They had proved something that was far more important than a tactical objective. General Thomas, watching the assault through his field glasses, turned to his staff. This was a man who was a Virginian, a man of his time. But what he saw on Peach Orchard Hill changed him. "Gentlemen," he said, "the Negro will fight." Now, it was a simple sentence, but in the context of 1864, it was revolutionary. Years later, Colonel Thompson would write about that day, quote, "I cannot close this paper without expressing the conviction that history has not yet done justice to the share borne by the colored soldiers in the war for the Union," end quote. While the U.S. colored troops were bleeding on Peach Orchard Hill, the decisive moment of the battle was unfolding 3 miles away on the Confederate left. Compton's Hill. It was a steep, tree-covered knob that anchored the Confederate line. Defending it was Bates's division, including the 20th Tennessee Infantry and Finley's Florida Brigade. We have the diary of William McLeod, a private in the 7th Florida Volunteers, who stood on that hill. His diary entries for these days describe the misery of the cold and the terrifying realization of being surrounded. Commanding the 20th Tennessee was Colonel William Shy. Shy was 26 years old, a handsome pre-war farmer from Franklin. He was a veteran, a survivor of every major battle of the Army of Tennessee. And now he stood on the muddy summit of this hill, looking down at an ocean of Union blue. The position was a trap. The Confederate Engineering Corps had made a fatal mistake. They had placed the entrenchments too far back from the crest of the hill. This meant that the Union troops could climb the steep slope and get within yards of the summit without being seen or even fired upon. Once they popped over the rim, they would be right on top of the defenders. Facing Shies Hill was General John MacArthur, a feisty, impatient Scotsman commanding a Union division. MacArthur had been waiting all day for orders to attack. He watched as the rain fell. He watched the Confederates digging in. Finally, he decided he wouldn't wait for Thomas or Schofield. He would take the hill himself. "I'm going to take that hill," MacArthur told a staff officer. He ordered his men to fix bayonets. At 4 p.m., MacArthur's division surged forward. They didn't yell. They didn't fire. They just climbed. They scrambled up the wet, muddy slope, grabbing onto tree roots and bushes. At the top, Colonel Shy and his Confederates waited. They were cold, wet, and exhausted, and they knew what was coming. Suddenly, the blue wave crested the hill. The fighting was instantly hand to hand. There was no time to reload. It was bayonets, clubbed muskets, and fists. Colonel Shy stood in the center of the melee, trying to rally his men. "Hold the hill," he screamed. "Hold the hill!" A Union soldier raised his musket and fired from point-blank range. The minie-ball struck Colonel Shy in the center of his forehead. The range was so close that the powder burned his skin. He fell dead instantly. The Confederate line was shattered. This wasn't a retreat. It was a complete collapse. The defenders of Compton's Hill were overwhelmed. General Thomas Benton Smith, commanding the Confederate brigade, surrendered. In the chaos, a Union officer, perhaps filled with the battle rage that sometimes consumes men in these moments, struck the unarmed General Smith over the head with his saber repeatedly, cracking his skull. Smith survived the wound, but the brain injury was so severe that he would eventually spend the rest of his life in an asylum. But William Shy was gone. His body was left on the summit as the battle rolled over him. When he was found later, he had been stripped of his clothes and in a final indignity bayoneted to a tree. His family would come for him. A friend, Mrs. Virginia Cliff, would bring a wagon to carry his body home. The hill would never be called Compton's Hill again. From that day forward, it was known as Shy's Hill. Now, there's a tragic postscript to Colonel Shy's story. In 1977, his grave in Franklin was disturbed by vandals. When authorities investigated, they found a body so well preserved, dressed in a tuxedo, which turned out to be his burial suit, that they initially thought it was a recent murder victim. It took a forensic anthropologist named Dr. William Bass to identify the powder burns on the skull and match them to a mini ball that killed him on a wet December afternoon. Even in death, William Shy couldn't find immediate peace. With the fall of Shy's Hill, the Confederate line unzipped from left to right. It was a domino effect of panic. One Confederate soldier screamed, "The bottom is out of the bucket!" The Army of Tennessee, the army that had fought so bravely at Shiloh, at Chickamauga, at Stones River, disintegrated. Men threw away their rifles. They threw away their knapsacks. They ran. They ran south toward the Granny White Pike, toward the Franklin Pike, toward anything that looked like safety. It was a scene of utter chaos. The rain was pouring down. The mud was knee-deep in places. Union cavalry slashed into the retreating mobs. Artillery shells exploded in the throngs of fleeing men. In the midst of this rout, we return to Mary Bradford. Remember Mary, the woman whose house stood near the pike? As the broken Confederate army streamed past her door, Mary Bradford didn't hide in her cellar. She walked out onto the road. She stood there amidst the whizzing bullets and the screaming shells, and she tried to stop the retreat. She grabbed soldiers by their arms. She pleaded with them. "Turn back," she cried. "Fight for your country. Fight." It was a surreal moment of heroism by a civilian woman standing in the mud, trying to turn the tide of a lost war with her bare hands. But this tide was too strong. The soldiers looked at her with wild, terrified eyes, and they kept running. They streamed past her, a river of gray ghosts, leaving her standing alone in the rain. Just south of Mary Bradford's home, a final, desperate stand took place. We know of this through the memoir of Private John Johnston of the 14th Tennessee Cavalry. Johnston describes the confusion of the retreat. He calls it the Battle of the Barricade on Granny White Pike. In the darkening gloom, a group of Confederates threw up a hasty barrier across the road to try and slow the pursuing Union cavalry. Johnston wrote of the chaos, quote, "We retired slowly before them southward until we crossed a small stream and took position behind," end quote. His memory of the exact location is a bit hazy. He admitted later he was confused by the terrain, but the ferocity of the moment was clear. It was a fight for survival, a desperate delaying action to buy time for the army to escape. The retreat from Nashville was a nightmare for the men. It was one of the saddest chapters in American military history. Hood's army wasn't just beaten, it was destroyed. They had lost their artillery. They had lost thousands of prisoners. And now they had to march south back to Alabama in the dead of winter. And they did it, for the most part, barefoot. We have the diary of Confederate Private Robert Battle to tell us what that looked like. He described the retreat, quote, "Some captured wagons and 300 captured prisoners passed our rear, some of them barefooted." But it wasn't just the prisoners. It was the army itself. Shoes had disintegrated in the mud. Men wrapped their feet in rags and pieces of blankets and rawhide cut from dead horses. They left bloody footprints in the snow that followed the rain. They marched through Franklin, past the graves of the men they had lost a few weeks earlier. They marched through Pulaski, a town that was haunted by its own ghost. A year earlier, in November 1863, a young Confederate scout named Sam Davis had been hanged in Pulaski by Union forces. Davis had been captured with sensitive papers and refused to give up his source. His last words were, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than betray a friend." And now, as the broken army limped through Pulaski, the memory of Sam Davis hung over them, a symbol of a cause that was now dying as surely as he had. Sam Watkins, the famous diarist of Company H, was there in the retreat. He had been wounded at Nashville, 8 bullet holes in his coat, 1 in his thigh, 1 in a finger. He limped along with the rest. Watkins, who, if you read his diary, was always somewhat of a cynic. He was also one of the few real voices we have of the everyday soldier throughout the war. And he summed it up better than I think any general could. He recalled the running, the panic, and the sheer absurdity of it all. He quotes a comrade, a man he called Tennessee, who had been known for his running speed. "Well, boys," Tennessee said, I'm beat, but hang me if I didn't outrun the whole Yankee army coming out of Kentucky. Bully for Bragg. He's hell on a retreat." It was a form of gallows humor. Honestly, it was the only shield they had left. The Army of Tennessee escaped across the Tennessee River on December 27th. But as an effective fighting force, it was finished. John Bell Hood resigned his command soon after, and the war in the West was effectively over. So what became of the men that we talked about earlier from this battle? Well, Chaplain Edwards of the 7th Minnesota survived. He kept his diary and his sketches, preserving the face of the red-haired Confederate colonel and the terror of the refugees. Sergeant Theophilus Watson of the 13th U.S. Colored Troops lies in the Nashville National Cemetery, grave number 12389. He never saw the freedom that he fought for, but he bought it for others with his life. General Thomas Benton Smith, the man whose skull was cracked at Shies Hill, lived until 1923, spending 47 years in the Central State Hospital for the Insane. He was a living ghost of the battle for Nashville, his mind shattered by a saber blow on a rainy afternoon. The Battle of Nashville was a decisive Union victory. It vindicated George Henry Thomas. It destroyed the Confederate Army of Tennessee. But when you strip away the maps and the arrows, what remains? A frozen hill, a bloody flag, men fighting for their own freedom, a woman standing in the road screaming at the wind, and the sound of bare feet marching away in the darkness. This has been Stories of the Civil War. Thanks for listening.